Namaste all. I'm delighted to host this podcast today on the topic of cultural genocide. The guest today is Arti Agarwal, who is an alumni of the Indian Institute of Technology, Roorkee, and Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is an author and a researcher, and she also appeared on an Insight UK podcast in October 2023, where she spoke about the stages and patterns of Hindu genocide, a topic closely linked to what we will be discussing in today's podcast. So, Namaste, Adiji. How are you today?
Namaste, Prem. I'm doing very well.
Brilliant. So, what made you want to talk about cultural genocide, especially Hindu genocide?
This is a question which has a very long answer, but I'm going to give you a shorter version today. Cultural genocide on its own, first of all, is not as well documented as other persecution, forms of persecution and other genocides, and especially so for Hindus. So even the actual overall genocide of Hindus has not been documented that well, and we're trying to fill that gap, of course, in the Hindu Genocide Project. But cultural genocide specifically does not receive much attention from anywhere, neither the media, nor the policymakers, nor the public at large, nor the academia for that matter. So there's like a big giant gap in even recognizing the cultural genocide of Hindus, not just documenting it or rectifying it. So that is why we started to work on this, and there are many forms of cultural genocide which I'm sure we'll come to later, but we have tried to at least do a little bit to fill that gap.
Okay, thank you. It's really admirable what work you are doing. Anyhow, let's just get straight to the questions. So the first question is, how would you define cultural genocide, and how does it differ from other forms of genocide or cultural appropriation?
Okay, so see, there's no one universally accepted definition of a cultural genocide. The word cultural genocide does appear in international law here and there, but there is no one definition which has been like universally accepted or acknowledged by UN or any other international organization. So that is the gap which I was just referring to. That cultural genocide itself, as a word, has many different interpretations based on the setting. That said, I will just give you like a brief overview of where the word cultural genocide actually comes from, which is from the works of Raphael Lemkin. So, for those of you who are not aware of who Raphael Lemkin was, he was a Polish Jew, and he wrote a book on the Axis occupation of Europe. And in that book, it's not a very small book. He has given a very detailed description of what is a genocide and what are the ways and means in which a genocide is executed, and why should the word genocide even be in existence. So this word was sort of formally, given a meaning by Raphael Lemkin in the 1940s. And the need for the word genocide arose because he has gone into a whole lot of detail about how it is different from denationalization, how it is different from mass murder, how it is different from other types of mass killings. And the key difference, apart from other details which we'll come to, the key difference is that of intent. One key difference is that of intent. So, in a war, there are casualties on both the sides. In a typical war, like, in a political war, but that is not considered as a genocide. So, when there is a selective targeting of a racial group, ethnic group, religious group, and there is a very clear intent of harming that group in any number of ways, which he has just gone on to describe, that is considered a genocide. And he has also gone on to explain how this genocide does not have to be concentrated to one geography or at one phase of time. It can be spread out on a timeline, and it can be spread out even geographically. So, what we're talking about in terms of the cultural genocide is it's like a subset of genocide itself, right? And let me just read out the actual words of Lemkin. Let me just find that passage. I highlighted it. So I'm reading out what he has written from his book. He says that genocide is a composite of different acts of persecution or destruction. He has further suggested, generally speaking, genocide does not necessarily mean the immediate destruction of a nation. It is intended rather to signify a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups, or we go on to explain ethnic groups, etc., with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves. The objectives of such a plan would be disintegration of the political and social institutions, of culture, language, national feelings, religion, and the economic existence of national groups, and the destruction of personal security, liberty, health, dignity, and even the lives of individuals belonging to such groups. This is a big bulky paragraph. What he's trying to say is that these are all the methods and ways in which genocide can be carried out, and the actual murder or the actual killing is just one of the ways in which it is carried out. And the annihilation of the culture, of the language, of the practices of any ethnic religious group is what we consider as cultural genocide. And this cultural genocide itself can manifest in different ways in different places. But then, I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself, I think. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. There's I never thought of it that way, so it's definitely an eye-opener. So for the second question, what historical or contemporary examples of cultural genocide stand out to you as being particularly significant?
Right. So let me first start with some of the more obvious, examples, which may be more there in public consciousness. So if you look at the continent of Africa, there is like very little of African culture still preserved in Africa, and that is mainly because of the colonization and then further persecution of the African people, such that the African people have completely lost touch with their original African culture. And this was carried out in multiple stages. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen over a period of 1 year or even 5 years or 10 years. It was a very prolonged, so to say, a very prolonged operation in which slowly but surely it was not just that the colonizers imposed their culture on the African people, but they basically made the African culture itself subject to legal legislations and eventually criminalization of their religious practices or cultural practices. So this is, an example of how a culture, just by belonging to a culture, just by practicing your culture, you can be considered a criminal, essentially, right? And then there is other, like sort of softer means of executing the same thing, which is like giving incentives to convert out of your religion or out of your own culture, or to give up your culture just so you can, have more economic opportunities. So like you will have more, you will be enticed with, say, more money or more food or more jobs if you convert, or if you give up your own culture and sort of just forcibly assimilate into a different culture. This is the copybook of the colonizers, and it has been so for a very long time. So the similar kind of thing we saw in North America, both US and Canada, where a lot of the natives, the Native Americans, they had to get into these kind of trades and these kind of agreements with the colonizers, who basically made them slowly but surely give up not just their land but also their culture. Right? So a lot of, I mean, all the land eventually was essentially Native American land. So they didn't just get a foothold on the land alone, but also their own culture. So the Native Americans are like a minority in the US right now. So of course that did not happen overnight. Of course it happened over, more than a century or centuries for that matter. But the main key here is not just the reduction in the number of the people, but the fact that a lot of Native Americans eventually stopped identifying as Native Americans. They forcibly assimilated into the culture, language, the religion of the colonizers. So these are like two very glaring examples of historically how a cultural genocide has been carried out. It may be that not everybody uses the word cultural genocide for these incidents or for these happenings and this kind of persecution, but as I explained, whatever we use as the framework for cultural genocide, it is a copybook example of cultural genocide. So these are some historic examples from the West. But if you come to the Indian subcontinent, a similar thing was happening in India also. For one, there were Islamic invaders who again imposed their culture on us, and there were so many, there were so many, like n number of incidents in which the Hindus were given a choice to either convert or die, right? So many Hindus were forcibly converted. If you're given a choice to convert out of your religion as opposed to death, like that is not really much of a choice. It's not, it's calling it a choice is really doing a great injustice. So there were many incidents like in the Mopla genocide, in the Noakhali genocide, and many, we have documented like hundreds of such incidents where Hindus were forced to convert out of the religion. But it was not just the conversion alone also. So if you see in during the reign of some emperors, like say the most glaring example is Aurangzeb, even practicing your religion, your religious practices were not allowed in open air. And because they were so threatened by the Hindu priests, the Hindu Brahmins, that they had this kind of strength, they had this kind of belief in their own religion, in their own shastras, that they would not convert, and they would not let other Hindus convert. So they eventually criminalized, the teachings, the Brahmins teaching in open to anybody. Then they also criminalized other Hindu practices. And slowly, if you see, a lot of the temples, the main Garbhagriha is very much, like recessed inside. It's not that easily accessible, and it has like a small opening and all that. That was done to prevent the destruction of temples, and that was done to sort of, in a way, monitor who is entering the temple. That is because again Hindus were forced to, stop going to certain temples, which are key centers of those religious cities. So a lot of the temples were, of course, also broken, and the temples were razed, and a lot of temples were converted from religious places of Hindus, like to mosques or to some other kind of a structure. And those are the usual examples you see every day of Kashi Vishwanath, of Ram Mandir, and of Mathura. There's so many, right? So all of these are examples of cultural genocide, actually. They don't get recognized as such, which is the bigger problem we are facing. But these are the historic examples of cultural genocide.
Okay, thank you. So, following on from that question, I know you mentioned about the forced like cultural genocide for Native Americans in Africa and of course in Bharat. So are there any particular regions in the world that have been disproportionately affected by cultural genocide?
So I mean, it's more of a question of which region has not been affected, because even if you see, whether you see the Slavic countries or the Baltic countries, like the basically all the countries which were under the Soviet Union in the post World War II period. So in all of those countries, the Soviets imposed Russian as a language, and again they taught, they expected all those countries to follow the Russian culture, the Russian literature, Russian language. all of that. And they were not really at freedom to use their own culture and their own practices, which was again a kind of a cultural genocide. To not to say nothing of the other kind of persecution. I'm only focusing on the cultural aspect right now. Then, of course, you have like regions like Ireland, where the Irish language was completely destroyed, and now there is, of course, a very strong resentment against the British, mainly because of these kind of things. So all of this actually does count as cultural genocide, even if it is not recorded as such in historical books. So, which is why I said, where has it not happened? And Africa, I already said, the entire continent of Africa has faced cultural genocide of all forms. And then, of course, if you go to Latin America, the Latin Americans had their own culture, had their own practices, and the Spanish Inquisition, and of course the Spanish rule, and similar colonizer settler mindset. All of those things have basically again made the entire Latin America into one monolith of Spanish culture. Of course, there are still differences because it's not like you can erase it completely. But each country used to have its own culture, the Aztec culture, and all the different kinds of practices, which were all slowly erased. So, and of course, I've already spoken about North America and Asia. So, Asia, if you still want to have more examples, like you can look at China. So, China was completely colonized by the Japanese, and the colonization of China included again these kind of impositions of the Japanese culture, the Japanese language, all of that. So there is literally no real region in the world which has not faced cultural genocide if you really start to, you know, tumble down this rabbit hole. Because in the beginning, it looks like something new, but if you really sit back and look at all our history, it is all over the place. So it's not a new phenomenon at all. It has just not been legitimized as such in history books.
Okay, thank you for that. So, what do you think are the primary drivers behind cultural genocide? Is it primarily a political tool, or does it emerge from socio-economic factors as well?
So see, the whole problem of genocide arises when a certain, religious group or ethnic group considers them to be superior to another religious ethnic group. So if you see, most of these colonizers considered all the, other regions which they colonized as less cultured. It was not a question of two different cultures as we generally try to understand these things as today. Like, today we understand that, their culture is different from ours. It was not just a question of difference of culture. They assumed, that their culture was better. We were not as good. So it was not really a question of respectful difference of culture. It was a question of considering another culture to be less viable, or basically stupid. Or they considered many native cultures to be like voodoo or something, simply because we worshipped nature, we worshipped rivers, we worshipped mountains. And not just Hindus, I mean, many native cultures have these kind of practices. Even in New Zealand, the Maoris worshipped nature. Even the natives used to worship nature. So it's like that kind of a philosophy does not match with their philosophy, the philosophy of the colonizers. There's an incongruence there. And in any way, wherever there was an incongruence between, these kind of philosophies, they always considered their philosophy to be the right one and to be the better one. Like, it was not a question of we can both coexist with our own beliefs. It was a question of my belief is better than your belief, and hence we are going to force you to follow our beliefs. It was that kind of a difference. So any cultural genocide eventually arises from some notion of supremacy, and that supremacy could be religious supremacy, or it could be some sort of other supremacy, like considering your own philosophy to be better. So for example, like in communist Russia, it was a question of spreading communism in the rest of the Soviet countries. In all the colonized countries, in whether it is Africa or whether it was India or whether it was other parts of Asia, because other than India, also many other countries were colonized. So it was a question of non-acceptance of our religious beliefs and imposition of other beliefs. So, like, there were many colonizers even in India. There were the Dutch, there were the French, and there were, of course, the British. So that was the running theme of all of those. There was the Portuguese, of course. How can I miss the Portuguese? So, in our case, especially in the case of cultural genocide of Hindus, there was a basic fundamental problem with the Hindu belief system, which is considered to be in, like, in the Western terms, polytheistic, right? And the Western idea, or the Christian belief system, is basically monotheistic, and they could not really accept the polytheistic version of a religion, because according to them, only their God, the one true God, the whole in if you study the history of Christianity, not just from the last 50 years or 100 years, from the last 200, 300 years, the whole idea of Christianity was hinged on this entire belief that there is only one true God. It was not a question of God with a small g. It was always God with a capital G. That is why they write it with a capital G, because there is only one God. It was not, if you write with a small g and you write it as any other noun, it is a general word, right? It can be applied to many people. But if it is capital G, it's a proper noun. It refers to only one true God. And they wanted other cultures to accept that belief, because they believe their religion to be better than ours. So there were other cultural differences rooted from this, that we had our own systems of medicine, our own systems of science, we had our own style of dressing, our own languages, like hundreds of languages, our own style of food for that matter. The like little things like how Indians like to eat with their hands was considered to be you know uncouth by the Westerners. And for all of these myriad reasons, we were considered to be lesser human than the others. So if you remember, in the previous podcast last year, I had talked about dehumanization as one of the stages of a genocide. And while not all cultural genocide stems from dehumanization, some parts of it are definitely, bordering on dehumanization of the other race or religious group or whatever. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely does. Thank you so much. I didn't consider religious factors to be part of it. Anyhow, so can you explain the typical methods as well used to carry out cultural genocides, such as language suppression, which you have mentioned, destruction of sacred sites, or forced assimilation?
So I think you already, like, mentioned some of the methods of carrying out cultural genocide, but there are some methods which you can see repeated over time and again. First is, like, either banning of religious practices or the criminalization of religious practices. And this is not just something we saw in the Islamic periods. It happens many times even today, where Hindus are sort of banned from taking out religious processions, or their religious processions are disturbed, right? Or they're not getting permissions to take out religious processions, or carry out their religious practices. So either banning of religious practices or complete criminalization of religious practices, which happened during the Portuguese rule in Goa and the rest of the Malabar regions. That is one way which has happened many times. The other way is destruction of cultural artifacts, cultural sites, and other artifacts of significance to a particular culture. So like what we're seeing in Bangladesh now, for example, they have destroyed so many, vandalized, not even destroyed, they have vandalized so many Hindu temples, and they have literally desecrated so many Hindu sites. Like they have purposely desecrated those religious sites with the clear express intent of offending Hindus. This is not just a question of destroying a structure; it is a question of defiling the deities who we worship. So these are again things which have happened time and again and have happened in many places in the world. So I'm giving the example of Bangladesh because it is the most recent one, and it's ongoing actually. So we do need to be more cognizant of what is really happening over there. But this has happened before also. Like even in Bangladesh, it happened in 2021. It happened during the many exoduses of Hindus from there during the Noakhali genocide, and so on and so forth. We've actually documented all of it, but it has happened in other places also. And it is still happening. There are many parts of India where the temples were destroyed and the deities were not just destroyed. Like Mahmud Ghazni took some of those vandalized deities back with him to his own region, and they were used as stones which line the pathway, like to show disrespect to Hindus, that our deities belong under their feet, that kind of a cultural disrespect. So it is not just a question of destruction, because when we normally talk of methods of cultural genocide, the books or the documents or even the articles, they generally talk about destruction of cultural sites. But this is one step beyond just destruction. This is desecration and very intentionally defiling a sacred site. So that is something Hindus have tolerated for a very long time, and as I explained, it is still ongoing. It's not something which is over, which is the most which is the most difficult part of this whole conversation. So there are other methods also, like the book burning, the famous book burnings. So like, of course, we know that in Nazi Germany, they burnt a lot of books of other cultures, of other religious and other kind of racial groups. But what we do not know is that similar kind of a book burning happened in India too during the Portuguese rule. So during the Portuguese occupation of Malabar region in India, the Portuguese burnt like mountains of books of Hindu culture, of Hindu authors, of Hindu shastras. We don't even know what all they burned because that doesn't survive anymore. All we have is some research by some scholars which mentions that. And when the colonizers left India, they actually burned their own documents also, which record these kind of incidents. So, it's both the things happening at the same time, where they're carrying out these kind of acts, and at the same time they're covering up their tracks. So they cannot be held accountable for it. And of course, we know about how all the libraries, like like we all know about Bhaktiyarpur and the whole controversy surrounding that name. And Bhaktiyar Khilji burned so many Hindu books and libraries, the entire library, and I've forgotten the exact statistic around it of for how many days or weeks that library burnt. So the Nalanda. So like we somehow don't consider these acts within the domain of genocide. That's what I'm trying to say. So we need to be a little bit smarter when we're talking about these kind of atrocities and these kind of acts, because we automatically assume that when we use the word genocide, we're talking about mass killings. But this is another way of erasing the cultural identity of people and the cultural roots of people. So when people have no cultural roots, it's very easy to force them to assimilate into some other culture. And when you are like starved and when you have no means of subsistence, it's very easy to convert you to something else and for you to just forget about who you even are. So it's a question you didn't ask me, but I think we could considering everything we're discussing, why is cultural genocide a problem? So this is something which Because this is a question which many people ask me actually, why do you have a problem with it? Right? I always thought it would be very obvious as to why it should be a problem, but apparently it's not. So, in a world when we are talking so much about diversity and inclusivity and these things, how can such a world coexist with a world where cultural genocide is not considered a problem? You're erasing the entire identity of a cultural group. How can that not be a problem? You are erasing the history of an entire cultural group, because it's not just about one incident, or it is not just about one book. You've destroyed entire historical records. You've raised the monument. So it's destruction of historically significant places and artifacts, right? So all of that is a big problem, and all of that is ignored by media, by government, by everyone. But the people themselves having forgotten that is the biggest crime, because when you erase a person's cultural identity, they don't even know which culture they belong to. They don't even know what they have lost when they lost their cultural identity. So that is why it's a problem, because you're basically, instead of accepting and respecting and encouraging diversity, you're actually destroying it and making the entire country into like one monolithic culture or something. So, I mean, it was a very long answer to your question, but please go ahead.
I mean, I completely agree with you. It is a disgrace, not only erasing our knowledge, but also the history behind everything. So it is an important issue to highlight. However, are there any recent or ongoing examples of cultural genocide that the global community is overlooking or failing to address? You have mentioned Hindus in Bangladesh at this current time. For the people listening at home, it's October 2024, where there is still ongoing persecution in Bangladesh.
So yeah, definitely Bangladesh, as you already mentioned, but also like in many parts of India, we are facing a similar problem. And I mean, the whole persecution and exodus of Kashmiri Hindus should have been like a sounding alarm for the rest of the country, but it did not serve that purpose, because if you see Manipur, the same kind of thing is happening. Manipur Hindus are being pushed to the fringes, and they're not just being attacked. I mean, they are being attacked also, but it is also a threat to protection of their own culture, because in India it is not, even though we call ourselves, all of us call ourselves as Hindus, it is not like one monolithic culture like that. Each region, each subsect, each sampradaya has its own culture, has its own way of celebrating festivals, of having different kinds of family functions, and there's a whole myriad number of things which are involved in festivals, are involved in our culture. So when we say that we lost the culture of Kashmiri Hindus, it's not like it doesn't matter, because that Kashmiri culture has its own significance, has its own place, and that Manipuri culture has its own place. So we are losing our cultural roots in many of these regions, and I have not mentioned Pakistan so far, but of course Pakistan is another glaring example, because every time there is some sort of a conflict between India and Pakistan, it is actually the Hindus of Pakistan who have to face the brunt of it. Hindu temples are destroyed in Pakistan, and Hindu girls are abducted and converted in Pakistan. And of course, their families are threatened. So, if somebody tries to take action, they cannot. And at the same time, like, Hindus continue to try and protect their culture, but there are many times when even they're not even allowed to go to the temple. So all of this is cultural genocide, and number of Hindus in Pakistan has been declining decade after decade. All of this is documented. None of this is new information actually, but this is ongoing. It's not like it has stopped. It is ongoing, and this is something which requires attention, intervention by international community, and of course Hindus themselves, Hindu diaspora, but it is not getting as much attention as it should have been. So, when you forcibly convert Hindus, that is also cultural genocide. This is one important thing which I've been waiting to say actually. When Hindus are forcibly converted out of their religion into some other religion, they obviously cannot continue with the religious practices. They cannot go to the temple, they cannot identify as Hindus, they cannot even pass on their cultural knowledge legacy to the next generation. So you are actually enabling the end of a culture by forcibly, or by other means, converting people out of a culture en masse. I'm not talking about one person here or two persons there. When it is, the number is in millions, it is it is something which is alarming, which should be alarming, because Hindus are very tolerant kind, so they feel like, live and let live. If somebody wants to convert, how does it matter? But it's not a choice. When your subsistence depends on conversion, it is not a choice. So that argument needs to be seen from this perspective, that if a person is given a free choice and if they're converting freely, it doesn't matter. But when a person is forced to convert, or if a person has to choose between living and converting, living and converting versus dying, or versus starving, or something like that, then it is not, cannot be called a choice. So these kind of discussions need to happen a little more from the point of view of intervention. Like, I understand the discussion at intellectual level is important, it is necessary, but it needs to go beyond that. Like, there is no law in India which can literally directly address forced conversions. I think I'm getting ahead of myself. So, I think I've answered your question, like what you asked. So I'll let you come to the next question, I think.
Fair enough. I mean, ironically, you were talking about the laws in India. So the next question is actually about policies. So how have governments historically contributed to cultural genocides, either through policy or neglect?
So it is either, like, it can be, there can be three ways. One is that the government is, like, they are themselves complicit in the genocide. So they create policies which criminalize cultural practices. That is one very direct way in which governments historically have enabled cultural genocide. The second is, like you said, neglect, in which, it is not the government itself which is carrying out the genocide, but there is a very dominant group in that particular region or in that particular country which is carrying out a genocide, cultural genocide also, and the government is not doing anything about it. That is neglect. And the third is, when the government explicitly has laws which prevent you from doing anything about an ongoing cultural genocide. So, for example, like, the example of the first kind is the blasphemy laws in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. So, those blasphemy laws are done to death, literally. They pick out small children, 10-year-old, 12-year-old children for blasphemy, and then, throw them into jail, they convert them, they use this kind of a algorithm. It's almost done algorithmically. They do this over and over again, and there is nothing you can do about it because the law is designed to persecute a particular community. The second is neglect. Like I was saying, that there is no law in India which you can use to address forced conversion out of Hinduism, or for that matter, any other religion. But the forced conversion is happening in large part for Hindus. Hindus are being converted out of their culture and religion very, very rampantly, and this the numbers are alarming. So again, we have documented the numbers, but they run into millions. So that is not a small number by any stretch of the imagination. So even though these numbers are so huge, there is no law you can use to address this. The only law you can use is if there is some foreign national in India preaching in India to convert Hindus. You can only address that. But if it is not a foreign national, if it is an Indian origin person himself or herself, there is no way you can do anything to do that. And they take it case by case. You have to build a case. It's a complicated process. Some places they try to do that, but it's not that simple, because the law itself is not clearly defined. And the third is where the law itself prevents you from doing anything. So, there are, not in India, but like I mean, at least I cannot think of any example in India right now, but in in Bangladesh and in many places, there are, like, laws in place which prevent you from taking action against, the persecuting party. And like, for example, like, even now, if you see, the persecution of Hindus is going on, and there is a cultural genocide going on against Hindus, but they are even just denying the fact that it is done on the basis of religion. They're just calling it political differences. So if you don't even accept that this is being done on the basis of religion, how can you legally do something about it, right? So there is no legal intervention possible in these kind of cases. So there could be, I think there must be better examples of this third kind, but I can't think of one immediately. If I think of one, I'll let you know later, maybe in the podcast.
Okay, thank you. So now the next question is more on technology's side, so about modern times. So could technology be a powerful tool for cultural preservation and also be a resistance against genocide? If so, how?
So it can be both. And technology, when we say technology is just one word, it can include so many things. So of course there is, generative AI is just one of the new tools we have, but there are so many things we can do. Like, you also have AR and VR, and you have, like, so many other tech tools, so to say, which can be used either to promote a culture, to teach people about a particular culture, or to teach them garbage about the same culture. So for example, like, there are some startups, and I know personally of some people who are trying to use both generative AI as well as, video games and other kind of tech tools, so to say, to educate people about art culture, or to make them get more interested in, say, Hindu culture, or learn about our itihas, or about Sri Ramayana and Bhagavad Gita. And all of these are very worthy things to do, because children need exposure to their culture in a way in which they enjoy. Not just, it shouldn't feel like learning, like textbook learning kind of a thing, but it becomes more effective when it is interactive, when it is fun, and when you're learning while playing, so to say, right? So technology can be a very very big aid for all of this. And at the same time, technology can also be used to sort of promote garbage about a culture. Like, a lot of the recent generative AI models are doing this, where they do not sort of even sort of acknowledge the genocide of Hindus. They do not acknowledge that something is a part of Hindu culture. And there, so, like, we know for many decades now, Hindu culture has been appropriated by other Western powers and things like that. And cultural appropriation is a different thing, but not acknowledging it as Hindu culture is a different thing. So they have completely denied any sort of Hindu origin of many practices. And also, like, there are many beliefs in the Western world about Hindu sciences, like Ayurveda, or like Vastu Shastra. All of these were sciences, and we have lost a lot of that knowledge today, which is why sometimes it may look like, oh, it's all you know just mumbo jumbo, but it's not. If you actually sit down and study Ayurveda, it's a proper medicine school of thought. So a lot of these generative AI models do not acknowledge it as that. They sort of again treat it as something like voodoo. Not in those words, but I'm just talking it, in the concept of the way in which it is treated. So technology can be used to completely deny a culture, or to teach garbage about a culture, or it can be used to promote a culture, or not even promote, maybe promote is not the right word, educate about a culture. So both possibilities are there. I think a lot depends on us, how quickly we are able to adopt these technologies for educating people about the culture, and how much we actually address the problems with generative AI and other tools which deny Hindu culture, or which teach garbage about Hindu culture.
From the next question, you mentioned about garbage being thrown on the internet, especially with generative AI. For context, in the UK, especially in England, far-right groups were basically rioting after the Southport stabbing and spreading disinformation about who the perpetrator was. Therefore, the next question is asking if there is an element of disinformation in social media contributing, sorry, to more cultural disinformation. Um, yeah.
Right. So there's definitely a lot of, cross currents going on social media. So there are, of course, Hindu groups which are trying to give, share positive coverage, or, give some genuinely educational stuff on Hindu culture, Hindu traditions, and stuff like that. And just harmlessly celebrating our festivals and sharing about it. But at the same time, there is a lot of disinformation where, you can see that there are like people with vested interest, and I mean, I'm just calling them vested interest groups, who purposely want to target Hindu communities in different parts of the world, and to enable this, or to make sure that they are successful in this, they spread disinformation so as to justify any conflict with that particular community. So even in Bangladesh, there was sort of like a rumor, which was started, that there was some kind of a rumor, like, there was Quran in a temple or something like that. And it was basically just completely false. And later it was found, after investigation, that that Quran was actually left by some Islamist rabble rouser kind of a person. So and this whole rumor was spread all over social media, and that started a whole lot of conflicts and a whole lot of attacks on the Durga Puja pandals, and a lot of there were many mass killings, and there were many houses which were completely razed, or which were arson, temples were arsoned. So it started a whole cascade of attacks on Hindus based on just one rumor, one rumor of disrespect of one holy book. And this is just one example, which I mean, I could think of out of the top of my head. But there are many such examples many times, where it's not even a question of a rumor, it is a question of mislabeling of Hindus. It's like, if you call Hindus as far right, and if you call Hindus as extremists, it automatically makes us sort of look like, we are the ones who are bad, even if we are the ones who are getting beaten up. Like, it's like that mad dog technique, where if you call any dog a mad dog, it completely justifies your beating up that dog, or you're even killing that dog. So similarly, if you just conveniently label Hindus as extremists or as far right, it automatically creates a wave of sympathy for the other community, which is actually targeting Hindus. And in this whole, you know um, pool of disinformation, like, a lot of things get lost in translation. Many people just jump onto the bandwagon and start attacking Hindus, start hurling all sorts of slurs at Hindus for no fault of Hindus. We've not done anything, So this kind of disinformation is used very regularly, and especially on social media, to target Hindus and to sort of mislabel us and our culture, where we are just innocuously celebrating some festival, but it will suddenly be given a very discriminatory color, or it will be given a very, um, you know, um, there will be some conflict which is created around it, or something like that. And these kind of acts are carried out very regularly. This is not something new, it has been done for a very long time. And this whole thing starts an entire cascade of disinformation. You see, it starts with one mislabeling or one rumor or something, and suddenly there's like thousands and thousands of tweets and accounts and posts which perpetuate this kind of a attack on Hindus. And it's like a, what do you call it? It's like a trigger, like a flamingo. No, what do you call those things? Domino effect. Yes, it's like a domino effect. Like it starts with one place, and then it carries on, like, all over the country. Like example, Bangladesh. So it cannot happen like that unless it is pre-planned. So even though these things are, started as rumors and disinformation, the fact is that they are not random acts. They're actually planned to target Hindus. And the very fact that there is such a strong domino effect should basically raise awareness about the fact that this is a planned act. It is not some random act of one, influencer or one social media account labeling Hindus as, misogynistic, or as, casteist, or a supremacist, or whatever, or extremist. It is not just one person doing that. How is it that suddenly there are thousands and thousands and thousands of people not just spreading this kind of Hindu phobia, but also physically attacking temples, physically assaulting Hindus? So it is all planned, and all of this is done very strategically using social media as a vehicle for spreading, this disinformation, so that they are not legally accountable. You see, if you can always justify your action as, you're just targeting an extremist, suddenly you're the hero, you're no longer the villain, right? So all of this is, of course, happening in as we speak. It is still ongoing. Like in Bangladesh, they're very conveniently hiding their acts as differences between political parties. They're not at all even willing to even acknowledge that Hindus are being targeted for being Hindus. So, what you said about social media, it plays a huge role. And while we're on the subject, I think it's also important to consider the role of social media in freedom of speech. So, while freedom of speech is very regularly used to spread hatred, if we actually have true freedom of speech, we can actually learn both sides of the story. But a lot of the social media platforms do not allow that. So the the one platform, which is Twitter, which has at least some level of freedom of speech, not entirely, but because of that, like, a lot of the news of Bangladesh was able to reach outside of Bangladesh, because Bangladesh media and everything were completely banned from reporting about crimes against Hindus. So, like, freedom of speech matters when the media itself is not at freedom to talk about these kind of crimes. So when you talk about how social media is responsible for disinformation, at the same time, social media can also be responsible for live reporting of crimes in different regions. And that is really important, because without that, we would not even know about what is even happening in Bangladesh. So I think more social media platforms need to be made accountable for banning information which presents both sides of the story. So they cannot be the judge of what is, what is right and what is wrong. Unless it is very obviously misinformation, they cannot be the judge and censor information before it even comes to light, right? So many social media platforms are doing that. So I think it is important for us Hindus to constantly build pressure on these tech companies to not censor information, and to make them accountable, basically. So I mean, does that answer your question?
It definitely does, yeah. Social media companies and even the media in general actually do have a key role in this. But what actions can individuals and societies play in order to prevent cultural genocide in the future?
So see, there are like so many things we can do from different perspectives. First is we need to educate ourselves, and we need to ourselves be aware of all the ways in which we have faced cultural genocide in the past, so that we can even recognize it when it is happening in real time. A lot of people, especially Hindus, we ourselves don't know anything about our history of persecution, or what kind of cultural genocide we have faced in the past. And that makes it very easy, makes us very vulnerable to exploitation and further persecution. if you know history and you choose to not learn from it, it's a different matter. But if you don't even know your own history, you don't even know what you don't know, right? So unless if you study history and if you actually are good at it, you will understand all the ways in which you have been persecuted in the past. And hence, when something like that happens again, you can do something to prevent it, and then of course from there there's an entire stream of things you can do to do something. But if you don't even know that you are being converted or you are being exploited or you are being marginalized, you will not do anything. You will think, this is only how it is, this is normal. So, first, important aspect is educating our own selves. Then, of course, once you are aware of the problem, which comes from being educated about the problem, once you know the problem, you can do a n number of things. If you are more interested in, say, advocating, you can, work with the lawmakers and the policymakers and make sure that the laws of your region, of your country, are not marginalizing Hindus or are not being misused to marginalize Hindus. And if required, you can, request the lawmakers to implement legislation which protects your human rights. Right? That is the basic idea of advocacy. And you can, of course, advocate for human rights of other regions, of Hindus in other parts of the world. So that is one important aspect which I think many organizations are now doing very well, and continue. I hope they will continue in the same way, because we have seen some improvement. We have seen some kind of recognition of atrocities on Hindus in the last 4 or 5 years. So that is one thing. Then there are, like, other things which can help with one or the other of these things. Like, if you like academics, you can, actually work on documenting or on recording real history, or on, making sure that we have representation in academia, for that matter. Then there is media. If journalism is what appeals to you, you can be one honest journalist who actually talks about real human right violations of Hindus, amongst other things. I mean, I'm not saying that's all you have to do. You can at least be honest about it. So there are, like, I personally believe that, whichever profession you are in, there is always something you can do in that framework to make sure that not just you, but other, Hindus in other parts of the world are also not being sidelined and not being marginalized, not being persecuted. So, if at all you're in a job where you really don't think you can do anything, then you can financially support organizations or individuals who are doing all this. And if you can't do that, then you can volunteer with these organizations or individuals who are doing something. But lobbying with the lawmakers is something everybody can generally do, whichever job you may be in. And I mean, I know that a lot of people lay a lot of emphasis on social media, and yes, it is important. And if that is what appeals to you, you can be, like, a person who raises awareness on issues on social media. But that alone, I don't feel is enough. I think, social media alone is not an end in itself. It's a means to an end. So we need to use social media as a tool and not as an end in itself. When we talk about advocacy or when we talk about education, I feel like, we need more than just social media warriors. We need actual people working on ground or working in their jobs or working in some other capacity to protect Hindu culture. I don't know if that
Okay.
answers your question.
Yeah, it definitely does. And the final question, which nicely sums up everything, given that we've been talking about the media and learning history. So, how can the media, educational institutions, and advocacy groups raise awareness and support the preservation of endangered cultures?
So there are, like, many things they can do. I mean, if they just do their job right, none of this would be a problem. If they just uphold basic honesty and integrity in whatever they're doing, we would not have this problem. If academia, institutions, journalists, if they do their jobs honestly, with integrity, without biases, then we would not have this problem. How is it possible that there is very little documentation of persecution of Hindus in in media, in academia. It can only happen when people are not looking at that very obvious part of history with without any bias. If academicians do their jobs and look at history, study history without any bias, it is very obvious that Hindus were persecuted. They're not looking at it without bias. So, which is why I feel like, it's not even like, I mean, I could suggest that yes, they should do this or they should do that. But I personally feel like, they don't have to do something very exceptional like that. If they just do the job sincerely without biases, we would not have this problem. And I think a lot of Hindus nowadays have started to do this. Like, they have, we have at least some journalists who do try to document the Hindu side, and we do have academicians who are trying to address that kind of a gap. But still, it's very little. We need a whole lot more than what few handful of people we have right now. And also, like, apart from Hindus doing this, because it's a question of human rights. I'm not asking about some very high flung things. It's a question of addressing human rights. We need to, unless we can do it ourselves, if we cannot do it ourselves, or if we do not have the muscle to do it ourselves, we need to find people who can. So there, I'm sure there will be journalists, there will be academicians, and there will be other individuals and organizations who can work with us, who can do that kind of work authentically. So we need to find those people and fund them, give them grants, or lobby with them, work with them, get into some collaboration with them. And there are a number of ways of doing these things. We need to do that well. Like, at this point, I think I will mention that the Jewish people have done this part very well. Their documentation is meticulous. If you see whether it is in academia, whether it is in journalism, whether it is in advocacy, they have historically done this part very meticulously, and it's for a reason, because they know how serious a problem you can run into if you don't do this part. So um, I hope I have answered your questions with this.
Yeah, you definitely have. So yeah, I appreciate that. So that does conclude our questions for this podcast, and thank you for joining us today. I would also like to inform our viewers about the website hindugenocide.com, which RDG has developed. This is a brilliant website that has a compiled list of known genocides against Hindus with references. Is there anything you would like to say about this website?
So the website is still a work in progress, actually, because the genocide of Hindus is so vast and it has spread over like 1600 years or something. So it's not a very easy task. So we are still working, and apologies in advance to all the people who feel like we have not done enough. I share your sentiment. I know we have not done enough, but we are still trying, and we will keep trying, and we need more people. That's what I would like to say. So if there is anybody who thinks this kind of work appeals to you, and you would want to learn, you want to work with me in continuing this kind of effort, please do reach out to me. You can, of course, email me or something. My email is arti@yeshitva.org. And otherwise, also, like, you can just reach out to me through the website or through Twitter. So it's not like we can do everything in a few years time, because this persecution has happened over hundreds of years. Documenting it and making it exhaustive cannot happen in just 2 3 years. So we need more people, and of course, if you want to donate, you can donate through the website. The links are always there. And we need a lot of people to share our content with masses. So that's it. Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, it's actually really admirable of you for actually compiling a website with known genocides and, of course, updating it. Are there any other closing remarks that you do have to our audience?
Not really. I mean, I would just ask people to get more involved in documenting the genocide of Hindus, because we are trying to do the best we can, and of course we would love to work with anybody who is interested. But a lot of times we don't even care about the numbers when these atrocities are happening in real time. And it's not just a question of putting them on a website. Many times we don't have those numbers, they don't exist. There is nobody who's recording them anywhere. And of course, we can't be everywhere, right? So, if even in your country or your region or your city, no matter how big or small a place it is, if you do know of persecution of Hindus happening in that country or in that region, please do try to find ways of recording, finding numbers, and recording actual original references and sharing that with us so we can record it also, because this is supposed to be like a compilation from n number of sources. So we are not claiming to be the original source of this information. We have given hundreds of references for everything. So we are trying to bring all the information that exists together in one place, which talks about genocide of Hindus. We're not doing field work here. We can't go to all the places in the world to document it, and a lot of it is historical, which is why we need people all over the world who can help us out.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So that concludes our podcast for today. Thank you again to Arti for joining me on this topic about cultural genocide. To the viewers at home, hope you have a good time. Namaste.
Namaste.